The Moon Calder 9 had one road worth dying on. It wasn't much of a road, more of a tunnel cut through volcanic rock, 40 meters wide, with ceiling lights that flickered every 3 minutes because the generator was old, and nobody had bothered fixing it before the war arrived. The walls were black and wet. The ceiling was low at the center arch. It smelled like iron and cold smoke, and the particular damp that lives inside rock that hasn't seen sunlight in 1,000 years. It was called the Vethera Gate, not because it was grand, because it was the only way through. On one side of the gate, 3.2 million civilians moved through evacuation corridors toward the transport ships. Families with children pressed against their chests. Old people in wheelchairs being pushed by other old people. A hospital transport with 8 patients still attached to machines that beeped with every heartbeat. All of them moving. All of them needing 12 more hours before the last ship cleared the moon's gravity. On the other side, the shroud. Nobody knew exactly what the shroud was. A hive, most people said. A collective intelligence that spread through space the way rot spreads through wood. Quietly, completely, without asking permission. It didn't take prisoners. It didn't send diplomats ahead of itself. It didn't leave anything behind when it passed through except silence. It came, things ended, and it moved on to the next thing. It was moving now. Sergeant Yael Dross stood at the tunnel mouth with a combat knife jammed into the rock at eye level and a dead soldier's ration pack held flat against the wall beside it. Oh, she was measuring sightlines. She had been doing this for 20 minutes. She had done it 3 times already, but she kept doing it because the numbers needed to be right, and she didn't trust numbers that came easy, especially not on a day like this one. 312 meters, she said, to nobody in particular. You've said that twice already, said the man behind her. And now I've said it 3 times. That's how certainty works. The man was Corporal Thomas Reyes. He was carrying a rifle over one shoulder and a crate of plasma cells over the other, and he was sweating through his collar despite the cold. He had a habit of humming under his breath when he was working. He was humming now, something old and soft, with a folk melody she couldn't quite name. They were the kind of song that sounds like it belongs to someone's grandmother in a rainy afternoon and a wooden instrument nobody plays anymore. She pulled the knife from the rock, turned around. The tunnel stretched behind her. Along both walls, in positions built into the rock's natural ridges for cover, 23 other soldiers were doing what soldiers do in the last quiet before a fight. Checking equipment, checking it again, eating things they couldn't taste, looking at the ceiling instead of at each other. They were not what anyone would have called a fighting force. Private Sarah Mack had been the base cook. 3 days ago, she had been planning a menu. Now she was crouched behind a plasma crate with a rifle she'd grabbed from the floor of the transport bay when the alarm started. She kept adjusting her grip on it, testing its weight, the way she tested the balance of a pan before she flipped something in it. It wasn't a rifle grip. It was a cook's grip. She was working on fixing that. Lieutenant Owen Carr was a signals officer. He had one arm wrapped tight in a medical sling, wrist to elbow, white bandaging already turning gray at the edges. His good hand was pulling wiring from the tunnel's emergency lighting panel and rerouting it into a bank of charging cells on the floor. He hadn't explained what he was doing to anyone. It was clearly working, so nobody had asked. Private Denny Vasht was 19 years old. She had been on Calder 9 to complete her navigation technician training. She had never been in a firefight. She had never fired at anything that moved. She was sitting with her back against the left tunnel wall, knees up, Vasht's rifle balanced across them, and she wasn't doing anything at all. She was just watching the far end of the tunnel with a very still face and eyes that were completely, utterly awake. Dross looked at all of them. All 23. She had done the math. She knew every single one of them had done the math too, because they were soldiers, and math was the first thing soldiers did when things got bad. Nobody was saying the number out loud. That was the agreement between them. Not a spoken one, not one anyone proposed or voted on. Just the kind of agreement that forms in the air between people who are all holding the same terrible thought at the same time and choosing, together, to keep holding it in silence. 12 hours needed, 6 hours of ammunition, maybe 7 if they were careful. One tunnel. Make 3.2 million people behind them. 24 soldiers. She walked the line. Not with speeches, not with words, just with presence. She stopped at each position long enough to see what the soldier had and what they needed, and then she moved on. She dropped 2 charge packs at Mack's feet without speaking. She moved a dead unit's shield plate to cover an exposed angle at the right wall that old Corporal Hentz had missed. He nodded at her without turning his head, eyes still forward. She checked the barricade Reyes had started building from supply crates and tunnel debris. She kicked one crate tighter against the wall. Better. At the end of the line, she stopped at Vasht. The girl looked up at her. "You shoot?" Dross asked. "Qualifying scores were good," Vasht said. "That's not the same thing." Vasht looked back down the tunnel. Her jaw was set in a way that had nothing young about it. "Yes," she said, "I shoot." Dross left 2 extra charge packs at her feet and moved on. Carr had finished his rewiring. He stood and flexed the fingers of his good hand and looked at Dross with the focused expression of a man who had already moved past fear and was now just working the problem. 2 extra hours of cell charge from the grid, he said. Maybe a little more. After that, the lights go. After that, we'll have other problems, Dross said. Yeah, he said. We will. She went back to the center of the line and stood looking at the far end of the tunnel. The lights on the enemy side were already out. Someone had cut them, or the shroud had. The tunnel beyond the reach of their own flickering ceiling panels was solid black. You couldn't see anything in it, but she could feel something in it. A pressure, a thickness in the cold air, the way you feel a storm before the sky has changed. Something in the dark was building. Reyes materialized at her shoulder with a data pad. Evacuation update, he said. They're saying 11 hours minimum, 12 if the hospital transport keeps to current speed. How much ammunition for 12 hours? He didn't answer right away. He looked at the pad. He looked at the dark at the far end of the tunnel. He went back to humming. Just a few notes, unconscious. That old melody again, up and down. 6 hours, and he said. 7 if we're careful and lucky at the same time. She took the pad, looked at the numbers. Looked at them the way you look at something you already know you're not going to like. Handed it back. We'll be careful, she said. The plan was simple because simple was what they had. Hold the tunnel mouth. Don't let the shroud establish any position inside the 40-meter width. Use the walls and the narrow space to cancel out what was certainly going to be a significant numerical difference. The tunnel was their one advantage. It meant the shroud couldn't bring everything it had through at once. Numbers became less important in a corridor. What mattered in a corridor was who held the ground. She didn't say the other part out loud, the part about what happened to everyone behind them if the ground stopped being held. She walked back to the tunnel mouth and stood there quietly for a moment. The dark at the far end was absolute. The flickering lights threw long shadows on the walls and then pulled them back and then threw them again. Cold air moved through from the far side in slow pulses, like breathing. Then the first shroud scout came through. It moved low against the right wall, close to the rock, the way things move when they are built for seeing and not for fighting. It came in without sound. It stopped 30 meters inside the tunnel mouth. It had no visible eyes, nothing that looked like a face, but it turned what passed for its head in a slow arc. Left to right, right to left. And she knew it was looking at them with whatever it had instead of sight. Counting, recording, measuring. She raised her fist. Behind her, 23 soldiers held still. Nobody fired. The scout completed its count. It turned. It walked back into the dark without hurrying, without reacting, the way a machine completes a task and moves to the next one. She watched it go. The tunnel was quiet again. Lights flickered. Reyes was humming. Somewhere behind her, Max shifted her grip on her rifle. It went to tell them what it found, Dross said. Her voice was flat and even. She wasn't talking to anyone in particular. 24. It went to tell them there are 24. She turned and looked back at her soldiers. Mac finding her grip. Carr checking his charge bank one more time. Old Hentz settled into his position like he'd grown out of the rock wall itself. Vasht still and watching, jaw still set. She almost laughed. The shroud was about to calculate exactly how many units it needed to destroy a force of 24. It would run its models. It would arrive at a number and commit to it with the cold certainty of a machine that had done this 10,000 times and had never once been wrong. It had never met a force of 24 that had already made its accounting. She walked back to her position. She checked her weapon. She ate half a ration bar without tasting it. She checked her weapon again. She aligned the spare charge packs along the top of the barricade in a straight and even row, because her hands needed something to do, and straight rows could be done fast. Reyes was still humming. The melody moved up and came back down, and it was something warm inside a very cold tunnel, and she didn't ask what it was. She just let it sit in the air. The pressure built. At the far end of the tunnel, in the dark past where their lights reached, things were moving. Well, you couldn't hear them yet. The shroud moved almost without sound when it wanted to. But the air changed. The cold deepened. The pressure that had been building for the last hour thickened into something you felt in your chest rather than heard with your ears. They were coming. Max said something low to the soldier beside her. The soldier let out one short, tense laugh that the tunnel walls swallowed immediately. Vash didn't move. Carr picked up his weapon with his good hand. Reyes stopped humming. 3.2 million people were somewhere behind them, moving towards ships, not knowing who was standing at the door or that the door even needed standing at. They were just moving the way people move when they've been made safe, without knowing the price of it, without knowing the person paying it, and without knowing there was a tunnel on a dark moon where 24 people were settling into position against the dark. Dross breathed out slowly. The first shroud unit at the far end of the tunnel caught the edge of the flickering light, then another one behind it, then more, filling the tunnel the way a tide fills a beach. Not rushing, just arriving, the way things arrive when they have no reason to hurry because they have never in their existence had reason to hurry. The sound came next, a low and steady hum that didn't come from any one throat but from all of them together, the shroud's collective voice filling the tunnel the way water fills a crack, finding every space. She sighted down her rifle. "Steady," she said. It was not a word she said for the soldiers behind her. They were already steady. She could see it in everybody along the line. No shaking, no shuffling, just the particular stillness that people reach when they've looked at the thing coming and decided to meet it anyway. She said it because she needed to hear it herself. "Steady." The shroud came, and 24 soldiers held the line. The first wave lasted 11 minutes. Dross didn't count the shroud units that came through. Counting was Carr's job, and Carr was busy keeping the charge banks running with one good arm. What she knew was that the first wave was large and loud, and it filled the tunnel with the kind of noise that lives in your chest for days afterward. A deep, grinding pressure sound, like the rock itself was being squeezed. The 24 held. They held because the tunnel mouth was 40 meters wide, and the shroud was trying to push through it with a force designed to overwhelm an open field position. And a 40-meter tunnel mouth is not an open field. Units clustered. Units blocked each other. The soldiers along the walls had clear angles on everything that moved inside the entrance, and they used them. When the first wave pulled back, there was a body count on the tunnel floor that was entirely one-sided. Dross walked the line. 3 soldiers had burns from close-range shroud fire. None of them left their positions. She checked each wound, redistributed charge packs, straightened 2 barricade sections that had shifted in the fighting. She stopped at Mac. The cook was reloading. Her grip had gotten better. It wasn't a pan grip anymore. She caught Dross looking at her hands and shrugged with one shoulder. "I'm a fast learner," she said. "I know," Dross said. She moved on. 8 minutes of quiet, then the second wave. The second wave was different from the first. The shroud had looked at what happened in the first 11 minutes and it had recalculated. It didn't send more units. It sent them differently, spread across the full 40 meters from wall to wall, moving in a pattern designed to force the defenders to split their fire. It was a smart adjustment. It was the kind of adjustment that a very fast and very cold intelligence makes when it loses more units than its model predicted. The 24 held the second wave too, but it cost them 2. Dross pulled both back from the line herself. One was still breathing, one was not. She arranged the second one against the tunnel wall, with her hands folded across her chest because that was the only thing she could do right now, and it was something rather than nothing. She went back to her position. She didn't look at the wall again. The second wave left the tunnel floor worse than the first. The shroud dead were piling up near the tunnel mouth, and the soldiers were already using them. Stacking them, angling them, turning them into additional barricade material. It was ugly work, and everyone did it without being asked because it was necessary and because there was no room in the next 11 hours for anything that wasn't necessary. Carr came to her during the next quiet stretch. His sling had soaked through with sweat. He had a pad in his good hand, and he held it out to her without speaking. As the evacuation update showed 10 hours remaining, 10 hours of civilians still moving toward ships. She looked at the charge bank count beside it. 5.5 hours. She gave the pad back. We adjust, she said. Adjust how? Shorter bursts, longer waits? Make them come to us instead of going to meet them? Carr looked at the tunnel mouth and then back at the charge count. That means taking more fire. Yes, she said. He looked at the numbers again for a moment. Then he went back to the charge bank without saying anything else. The third wave came an hour later. The Shroud had stopped sending standard assault formations. The third wave was methodical, a slow, grinding push that tried to use the bodies of the first two waves as cover for the units behind them. And it was patient in a way that machine intelligences are patient, without frustration, without impatience, purely functional. It was the same way water is patient with stone, not in a hurry, just constant. The third wave was the hardest. Reyes took a hit at the right wall, not a serious one, a graze along his outer arm that burned through his sleeve and left a line of scorched skin the width of a finger. He swore once, loudly in a language she didn't recognize, and kept firing. Vash didn't miss a shot. Dross watched her during the third wave in the half-second glances she could afford between her own firing. The 19-year-old navigation trainee who had never been in a firefight was picking angles that a 10-year veteran would have been proud of. Still, deliberate, not fast, precise. She had figured something out in the first 11 minutes of the first wave that some soldiers never figured out at all. That stillness and patience were worth more than speed if you were defending ground you intended to keep. When the third wave pulled back, Dross walked to Vash's position. Vash was reloading. Her face was completely neutral, the way a face goes neutral when it has burned through every surface emotion and reached something underneath that is quieter and harder. Good angles, Dross said. Vash looked at her. I study geometry. Keep studying it. She left her 2 more charge packs and moved on. There was a longer quiet after the third wave. 30 minutes of it. Longer than anything between the first 3. The tunnel floor in front of the barricade was a geography of fallen Shroud units now. Stacked and settled in ways that meant the next wave would have to navigate through its own dead to reach the defenders. It was not a clean sight. None of them looked at it directly. They looked past it or through it at the far end of the tunnel where the dark was. Dross used the 30 minutes. She moved up and down the line. She counted charge packs. She identified the positions that needed reinforcing and reinforced them. She checked on the 3 burned soldiers from the first wave, changed what bandaging she had, told each one what she needed from them for the next stretch. Each one told her they were fine. None of them were fine. She knew it. They knew she knew it. This was also an agreement they were all keeping. Old Hentz at the right wall had run low on charge packs. She redistributed from the 2 soldiers who'd gone down in the second wave. He took them without ceremony, lined them up along the barricade top with the same instinctive neatness she had, and settled back into his position. How many do you think there are? He asked. She didn't answer right away. She had been trying not to think about the total number behind the dark at the far end of the tunnel. It wasn't useful information. The total number didn't change anything they were doing or needed to do. Enough, she said. Hentz made a sound that was almost a laugh. Yeah, he said. Enough. Mac appeared at her elbow with 2 ration packs and held one out to her. Dross took it without thinking, ate it without tasting it. The cook had already eaten hers by the time Dross finished. She watched Dross's face while she ate. Oh, the way cooks watch people eat. Not for compliments, just checking whether the fuel was going in. The kid's holding up? Mac asked. She meant Vashed. She's holding up better than most. Mac nodded. I watched her in the third wave. She's got something. She's got geometry, Dross said. Mac looked at her for a second and then smiled. The particular smile of someone who hears something funny in a place where things shouldn't be funny. She went back to her position. The fourth wave came without warning. No buildup. No pressure in the air before it. The tunnel mouth just suddenly had Shroud units in it, moving fast, a different pattern from anything the first 3 waves had used. Not spread across the full width this time. Concentrated. 2 thick columns, one at each wall, with units cycling to the front from behind. One a constant rolling push that was trying to establish itself against both walls at once and split the line in the middle. It was a better tactic than the first 3. The first minute of the fourth wave was very loud and very close, and 2 more soldiers went down. Then Max stood up. She stood up from behind her crate, full height, which she didn't need to do, which made her a much easier target, and she fired directly down the center of the left column at a range that was too close for comfort because the left column had gotten too close for comfort. And she dropped 3 shroud units in 4 seconds, and then she dropped down again behind the crate. The left column hesitated. That was all it took. Carr hit the hesitation with fire from the flank. Vashti hit it from her angle. The column broke. The right column lost its push when the left one broke. Reyes hit it while it was adjusting, hence held the far angle. The 4th wave collapsed in on itself at the tunnel mouth and pulled back the way the others had. Not retreating, not running, just withdrawing as functionally as it had arrived, already recalculating. Dross walked to Mac. The cook was reloading again. Her hands were completely steady. There was a burn on her left shoulder, a fresh one, that she clearly hadn't registered yet. She registered it when Dross touched the edge of it to check the depth. "That one's going to hurt later," Dross said. "Everything's going to hurt later," Max said. "Later is later." Dross had nothing to argue with in that. She dressed the burn as fast as she could, tied it off, and stepped back. "That was good," she said. "Standing up like that." "It was stupid," Max said. "It was both." Mac finished her reload and settled her rifle back into her shoulder. "I cook for 300 people," she said. "You learn to see when something's going wrong in the left side before the whole thing goes." Dross looked at her for a moment, then she moved on. After the 4th wave, there was a quiet that lasted long enough for Carr to run a charge count. He brought it to Dross without expression, which told her everything before she looked at the number. 4 hours and change. She looked at the evacuation count. 8.5 hours remaining. She folded the pad and put it in her chest pocket and walked back to the tunnel mouth and stood looking at the dark at the far end. The shroud dead on the tunnel floor were a field now, dense and layered. The barricades had grown with each wave, absorbing debris and the soldiers' resourcefulness. Behind her, the line held at 20 soldiers, 4 hours of ammunition, 8.5 hours of civilians still needing the road. Somewhere out in the dark, the shroud was looking at its own numbers. It was looking at 4 waves and the result of 4 waves. It was looking at a force of 24 that was now a force of 20, defending a position it had no logical reason to still be defending. It was recalculating. She was also recalculating. She turned back to the line. 20 faces looking at her, or at the tunnel, or at nothing in particular, with the focused non-expression of people who are conserving everything for what comes next. "Listen up," she said, not loudly. The tunnel carried her voice fine. They looked at her. "In, we're going to shorter bursts, longer holds. Let them come further in before we fire. It saves charge and it improves our angles." She paused. "It also means they get closer." Nobody said anything. "Questions?" Nothing. "Good," she said. She went back to her position. She checked her weapon. She straightened the charge packs on the barricade top into their even row. She breathed out. The 5th wave was building in the dark. She could feel it again now. That deep pressure returning, the air thickening at the far end of the tunnel. 20 soldiers, 4 hours of ammunition, 8.5 hours of road to hold. She sighted down her rifle and waited. The Shroud Collective thought numbers. It had always thought numbers. Numbers were clean. Numbers were honest. Numbers told you what was going to happen before it happened. And in the long history of the Shroud's expansion through this part of the galaxy, the numbers had never been wrong. You took a position, you calculated the defending force, you committed the correct number of units, and the position fell. Every time. Not because the Shroud was cruel or ruthless or anything with a feeling in it, simply because the numbers said it would happen, and the numbers were never wrong. At hour 5, the Shroud's operational intelligence ran the calculation on Calder 9 for the 9th time. The answer it kept getting was impossible. A defending force reduced to 72% of its original size, 17 units remaining, should have a hold probability of less than 4% at hour 5 against the assault volume it had committed. 4%. That was the number. That was what the model said. And yet the 17 units at the Vithera Gate were still holding. We're still taking every wave and giving it back. We're doing things to the tunnel geometry that the model had not predicted and could not fully account for. The operational intelligence flagged the discrepancy and sent it to the observer. The observer had been watching from the rear of the assault column since the first wave. Its function was to record, to witness, to gather data that the collective could not gather from unit reports alone, because unit reports from assault columns were brief and functional and didn't carry the kind of information that came from watching. The observer watched everything. It had watched 17 waves now. It sent its report to the collective. The report was very long, longer than any observer report in the Shroud's operational history. Not because the observer was given to drama, it was not, but because the data itself was unusually dense. There was too much of it that didn't fit the established categories. The observer kept having to create new fields in its report format to describe things it was seeing that had no prior classification. Item: defending unit, identified as female, mid-range age, command position, moved a fallen enemy unit approximately 3 times her estimated body mass across 12 meters of tunnel floor to reinforce a failing barricade position. Duration: 40 seconds. This behavior has no strategic precedent in collective encounter records. Item: defending unit, identified as young, non-combat specialization, has maintained accurate defensive fire for 6 hours with no observed decrease in precision. Current fire discipline exceeds projected capability for unit classification by approximately 300%. Item: defending unit, signals specialization, reduced physical capacity, continues to operate from fixed position despite significant injury, has not withdrawn from line, has not requested relief. Strategic rationale: unclear. The collective processed the report. It ran the calculation again. Then it did something it had never done in its operational history. It held the next wave. Not because it had run out of units. It had not run out of units. It had sufficient force to flood the tunnel with enough pressure to simply bury the defenders under the weight of numbers, regardless of their positions and angles and adaptations. It held the wave because the data was confusing, and the Shroud, which had never been confused before, did not know what to do with confusion except to stop and look at it. Dross felt the pressure in the air ease. She didn't move. She didn't say anything. She just registered it the way you register a change in wind direction. A shift in something you'd been feeling so long it had become background noise. The push from the far end of the tunnel was gone. The dark at the far end was still dark. The Shroud dead on the tunnel floor were still there. But the building weight of the next wave's arrival had simply stopped. She kept her rifle up. Around her, the remaining soldiers kept their positions, 11 of them now. The tunnel felt wider with 11 than it had with 24, and not in a good way. There was more space between each person at the line, and more space meant more gap, and more gap meant more ways for the next wave to find a hole. She'd already adjusted for it. She had pulled the line tighter, compressed the barricades into a denser position at the tunnel mouth, given up the far flanks in exchange for a deeper and harder center. It gave them less ground to cover. It also meant there was less room to move if things went bad. She had not mentioned the second part. Carr appeared at her side. He was gray in the face, the way people go gray when they are running on the last of something and they know it. His sling had given up and his left arm hung at his side, are useful for nothing, which meant he was running the charge banks one-handed and firing one-handed and had been for the last 2 hours. "They've stopped," he said. "I know." "Why have they stopped?" "I don't know." She didn't lower her rifle. "Don't care, use it." He looked at her for a second. Then he went back to the charge bank. She used it too. 12 minutes, the most sustained quiet they'd had since the beginning. She moved up and down the compressed line, checking each position, redistributing what ammunition remained in the most even way she could manage. There wasn't much to redistribute. She was into the math now. The real math, the one she'd been keeping in the back of her head since Reyes first showed her the charge count. And the real math was not kind. She pushed it back. Later. Do the math later. She stopped at Vasht. The girl was eating. She had a ration bar in one hand and her rifle in the other, and she was watching the tunnel mouth and eating with the focused efficiency of someone who has learned that you eat when eating is available, because available is not a permanent condition. "How are your hands?" Dross asked. Vasht held up her rifle hand. It was steady. "Good," Dross said. She moved on. She stopped at Carr's position. He was not at the charge bank. He was sitting on the ground with his back against the tunnel wall, legs out straight, head tilted back. His eyes were open. She crouched down. Carr. I'm here, he said. His voice was there too, mostly. She checked the pulse at his throat. Strong enough. She checked the bandaging on his arm. It had bled through again, the third time in 2 hours. Inner and the blood was a dark color she didn't like. She redressed it with the last of the medical tape on her belt. It wasn't enough. It was what she had. The charge bank is set, he said. It runs itself from here. I set it to automatic cycle. He paused. It'll keep going for about 40 more minutes. She didn't say anything to that. After that, you're on whatever's left in the packs. I know, she said. He looked up at the tunnel ceiling. The static broadcast is running too, on Shroud communication frequencies. He said it like he was reading off a task list he wanted to finish before he handed it over. Modulated to sound like more incoming human units. It might buy time, might not. I don't know if they can tell the difference. She didn't know either. She hoped they couldn't. She kept that to herself. It's good work, she said. He turned his head and looked at her. He was 31 years old, she knew from his file, though right now he looked older than that. He had lines around his eyes that weren't there in his file photograph from 3 years ago. Tell me they're going to make it, he said. The ships. She looked at him. She didn't look away. They're going to make it, she said. He looked at her for another moment. He seemed to decide something. Okay, he said. He closed his eyes. She straightened his collar. It was a mechanical thing, something her hands did without her telling them to. Reached out, found the collar of his uniform that had twisted up in the hours of fighting, and smoothed it flat. She did it carefully. Then she stood up. She went back to her position. Again, around her, the 11 remaining soldiers held the compressed line in the quiet that the Shroud's pause had given them. Reyes was humming again, just barely under his breath. Mac was checking her grip. Hence was still at his angle on the right wall, a fact that Dross found quietly remarkable given that Hence was 53 years old and had been holding that position for 8 hours. The quiet stretched, 15 minutes, then 20. Long enough that the soldiers started trading small looks. Not hope. They'd burned past hope some time ago and landed on something harder and quieter. But something like curiosity. What was the Shroud waiting for? What had made it stop? Nobody asked out loud. Then the sound changed, not the hum of an incoming wave. Something different. A lower frequency. A single sustained note that seemed to come from the walls rather than the tunnel mouth. She felt it in her back teeth. What is that? Reyes said. She didn't answer. She watched the tunnel mouth. At the far edge of the light, a single Shroud unit appeared. Then it stopped. It didn't advance. It stood at the edge of the light and it did what the scout from the very first hour had done. It turned its head in a slow arc, left to right, looking at the 11 remaining soldiers, at their compressed and reinforced position, at the accumulated dead on the tunnel floor, at the barricades that had grown over 8 hours into something that was not what they'd started as at all. It looked for longer than the first scout had, much longer. Then it withdrew back into the dark. The low-frequency note faded. Dross watched the tunnel mouth for a long time after it was gone. Her hands on her rifle were very still. She was thinking about what she knew about the Shroud, and the answer was not much, but one thing she knew for certain was that the Shroud did not look twice at things. It looked once, and it calculated, and it acted. It did not send a second scout to look again. Unless it wasn't sure, she turned that over in her mind. The Shroud was not sure. She thought about 23 hours of operations she'd read in mission briefings. The way the Shroud had moved through colony after colony, through fleet engagements, through fortified installations, she could not find a single instance where the Shroud had stopped. Not once. Not for any reason. Until now. Until 11 people in a tunnel on a dead moon, armed with whatever was left in their charge packs, held a position they had no mathematical reason to still be holding, and made a machine intelligence that had never doubted itself in its entire existence stop and wonder if its numbers were right. She almost said something. She decided against it. Instead, she turned back to the line and walked it one more time, checking positions, touching shoulders, meeting eyes. Each soldier she passed was a load-bearing part of the line, and she treated them that way. Not with sentiment, not with speeches, but with the specific practical attention of someone who understood exactly what each of them was worth and intended to make sure each of them knew it. She stopped last at Vasht. They hesitated, Vash said quietly. Yes. Why? Dross looked at the tunnel mouth. Why looked at the field of Shroud dead? Looked at what 11 people had built over 8 hours out of rock and debris and charge packs in pure unreasonable refusal. Because we're still here, she said. Vash nodded slowly, absorbed that. Looked back down the tunnel. How long until the next wave, she asked. Soon, Dross said. Soon. But the pause was real. It had happened. 23 minutes of a machine intelligence that had never stopped stopping, because 11 humans in a tunnel had done something the numbers said they couldn't. She went back to her position. She checked her weapon. She did not straighten the charge packs on the barricade this time. She left them where they were and picked up her rifle and settled it into her shoulder and breathed out and watched the dark at the far end of the tunnel. The Shroud's next wave came. They held it. They held the one after that too. But the pause had been real. 11 soldiers had made an intelligence that spanned star systems stop and stand at the edge of the light and ask a question it didn't have words for. It hadn't stopped being an enemy. It hadn't stopped sending waves, but it had stopped being sure of itself. That was something. That was, in fact, everything. 4 soldiers left: Dross, Reyes, Mac, and Vasht. That was the line at hour 9. 4 people in a barricade that had grown over 9 hours into something that was more architecture than improvisation now. Layered, reinforced, dense with Shroud dead and tunnel debris, and the deliberate work of people who had nothing left to spend on anything except this position. The tunnel was not clean. It had not been clean for a long time. The floor between the barricade and the far end of the tunnel was packed solid with the evidence of every wave, stacked and settled and filling the space the way sediment fills a riverbed over years. Except this had taken 9 hours instead of years, and it was not sediment. They had learned the Shroud's patterns. You learn a thing's patterns when it comes at you enough times. The Shroud used 3 wave types now: a spreading push across the full width, a concentrated column at one or both walls, and a slow grinding approach that tried to move through the accumulated dead without breaking formation. The third type was the worst. It was patient in a way that made your skin feel wrong. And it required the most precise fire to stop because you couldn't rely on the tunnel geometry the same way with something that was already in among the debris field. Vash was the best at the third type. She had figured out the angles through pure geometry and through 10 hours of close observation, and she used them with the same still precision she'd had since the first wave. She was 19 years old, and she had now been in a continuous firefight for 9 hours. And something about that fact kept landing on Dross in the spaces between waves, and she kept pushing it away because it wasn't useful. The evacuation status came in at hour 9.5. Reyes read it and handed her the pad with his face doing nothing at all. 2 hours and 40 minutes remaining. She looked at their charge count. She looked at it for a long time. She handed the pad back. 2.5 hours, she said. Approximately, Reyes said. We adjust again. We're already at minimum burst. Then we go below minimum. Single shots when possible. Hold fire until the range is close. She paused. Very close. He looked at the tunnel mouth. He looked at the charge count. He nodded once, the nod of a person who has accepted the only available option. She walked the line. 4 positions now, spaced differently than before, each one calibrated for the geometry they had. The 4 corners of the compressed barricade formation, a box rather than a line, which gave them overlapping fire angles and no exposed backs. She had worked it out during the last quiet stretch and spent 20 minutes adjusting everyone into it. It was a better position than the line. It was also a position that only worked with 4 people and would not work with 3. She didn't say that part. The next wave came hard. The Shroud was past its hesitation. Whatever question the 11 soldiers had put in its collective mind had been processed and set aside. It was committing now with the flat determination of a thing that has decided the uncertainty doesn't change the outcome. It sent everything it had, all 3 wave types simultaneously, a combined push that tried to flood the barricade from 3 directions at once. In the first 90 seconds, Dross took a burn on her right side that went through her jacket and part of what was under it. She registered it, a hot, specific pain, the kind that becomes very loud later, and she kept firing. They held the wave. When it broke and pulled back and the tunnel mouth was briefly clear, she looked at the 4 of them and did a fast assessment. Reyes had a new burn on his left leg. Mac's shoulder dressing had torn open. Vashti was bleeding from somewhere on the side of her head. A clean line, not deep. The kind that bleeds more than it should because heads are like that. "I'm fine," Vashti said before Dross could say anything. "I know," Dross said. She handed her the last roll of medical tape from her belt. "Put that on it anyway." Vashti taped the cut one-handed without lowering her rifle. The next wave came before the tape was finished. The next hour was the worst of the 11. The shroud had stopped recalibrating between waves. It was just pushing now. When a constant rolling pressure that pulled back only long enough to cycle fresh units to the front, and then came again, 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 with the endless patience of something that understood it would eventually get through. The question was not whether. The question was when. Dross stopped thinking about when. Thinking about when was not useful. She thought only about the tunnel mouth, about the angle of the next unit moving through the debris, about her remaining charge count and what it could buy and how to spend each shot so it bought the maximum return. Reyes went down 2 minutes into hour 10. Not a fatal hit. She told herself that immediately and she believed it. He was on the ground and his rifle was still in his hands, and he was still firing from a prone position, which meant he was alive and intended to stay that way. But he was down and down meant he couldn't hold the right corner of the formation, which meant the formation had a gap, which meant 3 people defending a position designed for 4. She moved. She covered the gap herself, stretching between her own position and his, firing into both angles alternately, which was worse than 2 people covering 2 angles, but better than 1 angle going empty. Mac moved to cover the difference without being told. The wave hit the shortened line. It was the worst 3 minutes of Dross's life to that point, and her life had not been short on bad minutes. The shroud pressed the gap the way it had learned to press gaps, immediately without mercy, committing units to it the moment the firing thinned. She held the gap with what she had, and what she had was everything. Every shot exact, no wasted bursts, no hesitation, the charge pack count ticking down in the back of her head like a clock with a short arm. The wave broke. She was still standing. She looked at the charge count. 30 minutes. She looked at the evacuation status on the pad Reyes was holding out from the ground. 50 minutes remaining. She put the pad back in his hand. She looked at the tunnel mouth. She looked at the 3 people around her. Reyes on the ground, Mac with a shoulder that had stopped responding to its owner's expectations. Vashti still standing and still firing with the geometry she'd been using since hour 1. 20 minutes gap. She turned and looked down the tunnel behind her, toward the evacuation corridor where the last of the ships were loading. Dark down there too. Quiet, nothing moving. The last of the civilians were on the ships already or close to it. She turned back to the tunnel mouth. Reyes was humming again, flat on his back with his rifle up and a bad hit that would hurt enormously later, and he was humming that melody, up and down, that warm old song in a cold and ruined tunnel. She knew what it was now. It had come to her while she was covering the gap. A recognition that surfaced from somewhere under 9 hours of noise and effort. A folk song, something old, regional, something a grandmother might have played on a stringed instrument on a slow afternoon a long time ago. She didn't know where she'd heard it. She didn't know when. But she knew the melody now completely, could have followed it note for note. She didn't know why that felt like anything. She pushed it away. The next wave hit 15 minutes later and was larger than the last. The largest of the 11 hours. The shroud had made a calculation. It was close, the line was thin, commit maximum force and end this. It was not wrong in the calculation. It was entirely correct. 4 people, 3 really, Reyes on the ground, were not going to hold the largest wave of the engagement. Mac went down first. Not all the way. She dropped to one knee, kept firing from there with her good arm, her rifle against her thigh because her shoulder was done. She was firing from a bad angle, and she knew it, and she kept firing anyway because a bad angle was not no angle. Then the wave was inside the barricade edge. Reyes moved. From flat on the ground, he dragged himself upright against the barricade wall. Watt found a standing position that his leg didn't want to give him, and held it. He stopped humming. He fired into the closest cluster of shroud units, and the humming stopped because there was nothing left in him for 2 things at once. Vashti pivoted and fired and pivoted and fired, and her geometry was perfect, and it was not enough. Reyes went down for good. She saw it happen. She filed it and kept firing. Mac went all the way down, breathing, hands still on her rifle, not getting up. Vashti and Dross held the tunnel mouth for 4 more minutes. Then Vashti went down. Dross held it alone. She didn't know for how long. Time had changed its shape by then, was moving differently than it had in the first hour, not faster or slower, but without the edges it usually had. One moment running into the next without boundaries. She was at the barricade and she was firing, and the shroud units were coming through the debris field, and she was stopping them, and the charge pack count was very low now, and she was spending each shot like it was the last one she could afford, and it kept not being the last one. She didn't think about the number left in the count. She didn't think about the 20 minutes. She thought about the tunnel mouth and the next unit and the angle and the shot. Then the pad on the barricade edge vibrated. She grabbed it without looking away from the tunnel. Evacuation complete. 2 words. She read them twice. She lowered her rifle 1 inch, looked at the pad, looked at the tunnel mouth where the next shroud wave was building in the debris field. Then she sat down. She sat with her back against the barricade and her legs out straight and her rifle across her knees, and she just sat there. Her body made the decision before her mind caught up, and then her mind didn't argue because her body was right. She sat in the noise, and the cold and the smell of 900 minutes of everything a tunnel can hold, and she breathed. The shroud units moved in the debris field, not attacking, moving, adjusting. The wave was still coming. She breathed. Reyes's melody was in her head, up and down, the warm old thing. She hadn't heard him humming for 20 minutes, but she could hear it anyway now, running under everything else the way a river runs under the sound of its own surface. She didn't know whose grandmother it had belonged to. She didn't know what the words were, if there were words. Or she knew the shape of it, the way it rose and fell, and came back to the same place every time. She sat for 43 seconds. Then she stood up. She picked up her rifle. She checked the charge count. She settled it into her shoulder. The wave came. She held the tunnel mouth. The rescue team came through the far end of the tunnel at hour 12. Not the enemy side, the civilian side. They came from behind. 6 soldiers in fresh gear, moving fast, lights on their helmets, cutting through the dark of the tunnel. They moved with the specific purpose of people who had been told to get there quickly and were getting there quickly and expected to find something very bad. They found Dross. She was sitting on the ground with her back against the barricade and her rifle across her knees. Awake. Eyes open. She looked up when their lights found her. Evacuation complete, she said. The team leader stopped moving. She was a captain named Reyes. No relation. Different Reyes, the galaxy had a lot of them. And she had been doing this work for 12 years and she had seen bad combat sites before. She thought she had seen all the kinds there were. She had not seen this kind. Yes, she said. Evacuation complete. All ships cleared 22 minutes ago. Dross looked at her for a moment. Good, she said. That was all she said. Captain Reyes looked at the tunnel. Her team had stopped moving too, all 6 of them, their lights sweeping slowly across what the tunnel had become over 12 hours. The floor from the barricade to the far mouth was impassable. Not from active enemy. The shroud had pulled back when the evacuation completed, and went withdrawn to some recalculation point that its operational intelligence had decided was correct. It pulled back the way it did everything, without emotion, without hesitation, without anything that could be called reaction. It was simply gone, and where it had been was the evidence of where it had been. The tunnel floor from the barricade to the far mouth was completely packed. Unit after unit after unit, layers of them, filling the space from wall to wall so thoroughly that you could not have walked through without climbing. The barricade itself had absorbed so much of the fighting that it had changed shape completely from what it had started as. It was a different structure now, a heavy and final-looking thing that had grown and hardened over 12 hours into something that looked less like soldiers had built it and more like the tunnel had grown it. Nobody on the rescue team said anything for a long moment. Then one of the team, a young corporal who had been doing this work for 8 months, said very quietly, "How many people held this?" Captain Reyes looked at Dross. Dross was already standing, which the captain hadn't seen happen. She'd been on the ground and then she was standing, rifle slung. Like standing was a thing she'd simply decided to do without making a production of it. 24, Dross said, at the start. The corporal looked at the tunnel. looked at the barricade, looked at the floor. 24, he said, slowly, like the number needed time to mean what it meant. Yara, the others need medical, Dross said. 4 of them behind the barricade. Reyes first. He's been down the longest. The team moved. They moved fast and they moved well, and Dross stood back and let them work because they were good at their work, and she was empty now of everything that had been running her for the last 12 hours, and her job was done. She walked to the tunnel mouth on the civilian side and stood in the opening and breathed the outside air. It was cold on Calder 9. It had always been cold. The air tasted like rock and thin atmosphere and a little bit of the chemical smell that evacuation engines leave behind in a sky they passed through. 3.2 million people had been through this air recently, and you couldn't smell them. People didn't leave a smell in air, but she knew they'd been here, and now they were gone, and the air was just cold and empty and clean. She breathed it. Behind her, she could hear the medics working on the others. Quick instructions, equipment sounds, Mac's voice saying something in response to a question. Vash's voice faint. Reyes, nothing yet, but the medic said he was breathing, and the medic's voice was calm, which was the right kind of medic voice to have. She breathed for a long time. The Shroud Observer filed its final report on the Calder 9 engagement 6 hours later from its withdrawal position. The report was 37 pages in collective notation. Most of it was standard operational data. Unit counts, wave timings, trajectory models, the recalibration history, the probabilities at each stage of the engagement. Clinical, precise. The kind of data the collective processed in seconds and stored in its long operational memory for strategic use. The final 3 paragraphs were different. They were different because the observer had spent 6 hours trying to write them in standard operational format and had found it couldn't. The data in those paragraphs did not fit the standard format. It kept exceeding the parameters of the fields, not in size but in kind. The observer kept reaching for categories that didn't exist in the collective's operational vocabulary and having to write around them with approximations that weren't accurate. The observer noted this problem at the top of the final section. Wackett noted that the data in the following paragraphs could not be accurately rendered in standard format because the standard format had not been built to contain it. It proceeded anyway because the data was there and real, and ignoring it because it didn't fit the vocabulary seemed wrong in a way the observer couldn't precisely articulate. This is the relevant section, translated as closely as possible from Shroud collective notation. Regarding the command unit designated Defender Primary, this unit directed the engagement from hour 0 to hour 12 without withdrawal, without seeking relief, without any observable change in behavioral pattern that would indicate a reduction in operational capacity or intent. This unit absorbed physical damage at multiple points during the engagement. This unit sustained the loss of 23 subordinate units over 12 hours. Neither damage nor loss produced observable change in the unit's operational behavior. This is not a capability anomaly. The unit's physical and numerical limitations were clear throughout. It is a motivational anomaly for which the observer has no classification. The observer requests that this engagement data be preserved in a separate archive, distinct from standard tactical records. The reason for this request cannot be stated in operational terms. The closest approximation available in collective notation translates to, this data is not useful. It is something else. The observer does not have a category for what it is, but it is something that the collective should keep. End of report. 3 months later, the Memorial Commission found Dross in a rehabilitation facility on a station 2 transits from Calder 9. She was walking without the cane now mostly. Her right side still reminded her of the burn at certain angles and in cold air, which meant it reminded her constantly on the station, because stations were always cold. She had been through 2 surgeries and a round of cellular repair treatment, and she was told the full recovery timeline was 6 months. She was at the 3-month mark, and she was walking without the cane, and she had decided that was good enough, and the medical staff had decided not to argue with her. The Memorial Commission representative was a young man with a careful manner and a design portfolio. He sat across from her in the facility's common room and laid out his preliminary work on the table between them. And it was good work, clean lines, 24 names on a dark stone face, each one the same size, the same weight, the same depth, no rank, no title, just names. He said they wanted to add something, a phrase maybe, A quote, some text that would give visitors context for what they were looking at. She looked at the design for a long time. She thought about Mac adjusting her grip on a rifle she'd grabbed from a floor, figuring out the balance of it the same way she balanced a pan. She thought about Carr rewiring emergency lighting with one good arm and dying with his collar straight. She thought about old Hentz at his angle, 53 years old and present for every single hour. Who was in a different facility now and would walk with a permanent change in his gait for the rest of his life, and had told her in a message last week that he considered it a worthwhile trade. She thought about Vashid, 19 years old, geometry and fury, who was in officer candidate training now because 3 review boards had independently looked at her performance record from the engagement and reached the same conclusion without knowing about each other. She thought about Reyes humming. The melody was still in her head. It had been there since hour 1, and she had never asked him what it was, and now she knew. He'd told her in the facility, lying in a bed with his leg in a cellular repair frame, slightly embarrassed, that it was an old farming song from his home region that his mother used to sing. He didn't know why he hummed it when he was working. He always had. She thought about a 19-minute pause in a 12-hour battle, an alien intelligence that had moved through 37 star systems without stopping, standing at the edge of the light and looking at what 11 people had built, and not knowing what to do with what it saw. She thought about 2 words on a pad, evacuation complete. She looked at the memorial design for a long time. Then she looked up at the representative and told him, just the names. He started to ask a follow-up question, something about whether that was certain, whether she'd considered something more descriptive, something that would help people who didn't know the history understand. Just the names, she said again. He looked at her. She looked at the design. He wrote it down. The names were enough. The names were the whole story. 24 people in a tunnel on a dead moon who'd done the math and held the line anyway, who'd made a machine intelligence that had never doubted itself stop and wonder if its numbers were right. 24 names on dark stone, all the same size, all the same weight. No explanation, no footnote. The names held the line by themselves, the way the people had. The stone would remember, even if the stone didn't know what it was keeping. And 3.2 million people on ships moving through the black would never know the tunnel, never know the gate, never know the 24 who stood at the door. They would just be alive. That was enough. That was all of it.